"Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" she begged the stranger who turned out to be a chief executive officer. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain had stopped just minutes before, leaving the streets of New York City glistening under the yellow light of the street lamps. Sophie Hart stood outside the Grand Lexington Hotel, her fingers trembling as she fixed the strap of her black dress. Inside, a gala was already underway, an event hosted by the very company that had rejected her only a month ago. She was supposed to attend as the girlfriend of Marcus, her ex-boyfriend and former boss. But 10 minutes ago he had sent a message that shattered her composure. "I am sorry, Sophie, I cannot come. I think it is better if you skip the night too." Her phone screen blurred as she reread the text. Her chest ached with humiliation. Skipping the night was not an option. The company's public relations team was there, investors were there, and she needed to show them that she had moved on, that she could stand tall on her own. But the truth was, she was shaking. She could not walk into that ballroom alone. She turned toward the hotel bar, her eyes still wet, scanning for a miracle. That was when she saw him. A man in a charcoal suit, sitting at the counter, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. He had the kind of calm presence that made the noise around him fade. Sophie hesitated, then took a breath that tasted like desperation and courage all at once. "Excuse me," she said softly, voice trembling. "I need your help." He looked up, his eyes dark and steady. "My help?" "Yes," she whispered. "Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze held hers, as if measuring whether this was a joke or a plea. Then, slowly, he smiled a quiet, curious smile. "Pretend to be your date?" Sophie nodded quickly, heat rising to her face. "Just for tonight. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to walk into that ballroom with someone. Please." He studied her for another moment, then set down his glass. "All right," he said finally, standing to his full height. "Let us make it believable." Sophie blinked, stunned. "Wait, you will actually do it?" He adjusted his cufflinks, a faint glint of gold catching the light. "It sounds like you could use a little rescue." As they walked toward the golden doors of the ballroom, Sophie's pulse thundered. She had no idea that the stranger beside her was Ethan Reed, the elusive chief executive officer who owned the company hosting the gala. And in less than an hour, her one reckless request would change both of their lives forever. Sophie walked beside Ethan through the glittering hallway of the Grand Lexington Hotel, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The music from the ballroom pulsed ahead, elegant and intimidating. She could see herself reflected in the tall mirrors lining the corridor, her curls still damp from the rain, her lipstick slightly smudged, her shoulders stiff with nerves. She took a quiet breath and whispered, "What if someone asks how we met?" Ethan glanced at her, calm and unreadable. "Then you tell them the truth," he said. "We met tonight." The doors opened, and the sound of laughter and violins washed over them. Chandeliers spilled warm light across silk gowns and tailored suits. The air smelled faintly of champagne and roses. Sophie's pulse quickened. She gripped her small clutch as if it could anchor her. Marcus was there. She spotted him instantly across the room, his familiar posture, the confident tilt of his chin, the way he laughed too loudly at someone's joke. A sharp pang hit her chest, but she forced herself to stand taller. Ethan leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You do not have to prove anything to him," he said. She looked up, startled. "How do you know who he is?" "Because he has not stopped staring since you walked in." Her heart skipped. When she turned back, Marcus's smile faltered. His gaze flicked from Sophie to Ethan, confusion and jealousy crossing his face. Ethan gently placed his hand at the small of her back. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let us give him something to think about." For the next hour, Sophie moved through the crowd like she belonged. Ethan introduced her to people she had only read about in business magazines. His voice carried authority, smooth and measured. Every now and then, she caught glimpses of something deeper behind his composure, loneliness, perhaps, or exhaustion that even his power could not hide. When the speeches began, Sophie slipped out to the balcony to catch her breath. The night air was cool, smelling faintly of rain and city smoke. Her hands trembled as she touched the railing. She whispered to herself, "What am I doing? He is a stranger. This is insane." "Maybe," said a voice behind her. She turned. Ethan was standing in the doorway, the city lights casting a silver outline around him. But sometimes one reckless moment tells you more about yourself than 1,000 safe choices. His words hung in the air. Sophie blinked, unsure how to respond. "You speak like someone who has made a lot of reckless choices," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." They stood in silence for a while, the city humming below them. Inside, a new song started to play, slow and sweet. Ethan extended his hand. "One dance, for the sake of our performance." "Oh." Her instinct was to refuse, but something about his calm steadiness drew her in. She placed her hand in his, and they began to move, swaying to the music that floated through the open doors. For the first time that night, she forgot about Marcus, about the whispers, about everything except the warmth of Ethan's hand around hers. When the song ended, she stepped back, flustered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me tonight. I do not know why you said yes." "Oh?" Ethan looked down at her, eyes steady. "Because you reminded me of someone who used to believe people deserved second chances." Before she could ask what he meant, a voice called from inside. "Mr. Reed, they are ready for you." Sophie froze. The name echoed in her mind. Ethan Reed. She had heard it before. It was printed on the banners hanging in the ballroom, on the podium, on the invitations. He was not just any guest. He was the host. Her mouth went dry as he gave her one last small smile and disappeared into the golden light. Sophie stood alone on the balcony, the music fading behind her, her heart pounding in disbelief. The stranger she had begged to be her date was the chief executive officer of the company she once dreamed of working for. And she had just danced with him under the stars of New York City. Sophie barely slept that night. Her mind replayed every moment: the ballroom, the dance, the way Ethan Reed had looked at her before disappearing into that sea of powerful people. She had not realized who he was until the last second, and the shock left her dizzy. Ethan Reed, the youngest chief executive officer in the city, the man whose company had once rejected her job application without a second glance. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of her small apartment. The city outside was already awake, horns echoing between buildings. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, still wearing the same dress from the night before. Her heels tossed carelessly on the floor. Her phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. "You left without saying goodbye. Breakfast?" Her heart skipped. She typed back before she could overthink. "Where?" An hour later, she walked into a quiet cafe tucked on the corner of Fifth Avenue. Ethan was already there, sitting by the window with 2 cups of coffee and a small smile. Without the tuxedo, he looked different, still elegant, but less untouchable. "I did not expect to hear from you," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I owed you breakfast," he replied easily. "After all, I made you survive a room full of sharks." She laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "You could have warned me that you were the host of that event." He tilted his head, amused. "Would you have still asked me to pretend if you had known?" "Probably not," she admitted. "You would have looked too important to be desperate enough to help me." He smiled, stirring his coffee. "Maybe I needed a distraction as much as you did." For a moment, silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but full of curiosity. Sophie studied him, wondering what a man like him could possibly need distraction from. He noticed her look and set his cup down. "I have a problem," he said finally. "A personal one." She frowned slightly. "What kind of problem?" "My board expects me to attend a series of family events over the next 2 weeks. There are investors, partners, and my grandmother, who still believes I am in a relationship. I need someone to play the part." Sophie blinked. "You want me to pretend again?" Ethan nodded. "You were convincing last night, and you seem trustworthy." She let out a nervous laugh. "You barely know me." I know you walked into that ballroom when every instinct told you to run. That tells me enough." Sophie hesitated. The idea sounded absurd, But the truth was, she needed the money. Rent was due in 10 days. Her part-time hours had been cut again, and the small public relations firm where she worked was struggling to stay open. What exactly would this pretend relationship involve? She asked cautiously. Ethan's expression softened. Public appearances, dinners, a charity gala next weekend. In return, I will pay you well, enough to give you a fresh start. She stared at him, her heart racing. You mean a contract? He nodded, sliding a slim folder across the table. A simple agreement. No real relationship. Just a temporary arrangement. Sophie picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. She skimmed the printed pages, each clause precise and professional. There were clear boundaries, no romantic involvement, full confidentiality, and a firm end date. Why me? She whispered. Because you were honest, he said quietly. Most people around me have an agenda. You did not. Sophie closed the folder and looked at him. His tone was steady, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet sadness, the kind born from too much responsibility and too little trust. She exhaled slowly. If I say yes, when do we start? Ethan's lips curved slightly. Tonight. There is a charity dinner at the Metropolitan Plaza. It will be easier if we begin right away. Oh, Sophie felt her pulse in her throat. She thought of her overdue bills, her empty fridge, and the humiliation she had felt standing outside that ballroom alone. This was risky, maybe even foolish, but so was everything worth changing. All right, she said at last. I will do it. Ethan extended his hand across the table. She hesitated, then placed hers in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. Then it is a deal, he said. As she walked out of the cafe a few minutes later, clutching the signed folder to her chest, Sophie felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. The city seemed brighter, louder, alive with possibility. She had no idea that this agreement, written in ink and formality, would soon blur the lines between pretending and something heartbreakingly real. The following evening, Sophie stood before the tall mirror inside Ethan's penthouse apartment, hardly recognizing the woman reflected there. The city lights shimmered through the glass walls behind her, painting the room with streaks of gold. A professional stylist, hired by Ethan, pinned the last strand of her hair into an elegant twist. The navy gown she wore clung perfectly to her frame, graceful yet modest. She looked like someone who belonged in Ethan Reed's world. Ethan entered from the hallway, adjusting the cuffs of his dark suit. You look perfect, he said simply, his tone sincere rather than flattering. Sophie turned toward him, still uncertain. Perfect for a lie, she replied quietly. He met her eyes. A temporary performance, he corrected. You will be fine, just remember the rules. He had outlined them that afternoon while his assistant finalized the contract. Rule 1. Keep the story simple. Rule 2. No romantic gestures in private. Rule 3. Never reveal the arrangement. Sophie had nodded to each, even though her stomach twisted tighter with every word. They rode the elevator down together, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. When the doors opened, a sleek black car waited. As they drove through the glittering streets toward the Metropolitan Plaza, Sophie gazed out the window, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Relax, Ethan said, noticing her tension. You are not on trial. You are helping me and helping yourself. She gave a small, nervous laugh. It still feels like I am playing a part I was never trained for. Then treat it like a job, he said. You are good at those. The car slowed to a stop at the grand entrance. Cameras flashed outside, a wave of light and sound that made Sophie's heart leap. Ethan stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. The moment her fingers touched his, the crowd of photographers turned their lenses toward her. The flashes were blinding, relentless. Inside, the ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved like shadows carrying trays of champagne. Conversations hummed with polished laughter. Sophie followed Ethan's lead, remembering every cue he had taught her: smile, make eye contact, nod gracefully. Several guests approached, offering polite greetings and curious glances. Ethan introduced her as his partner, his tone smooth and assured. Each time he said her name, Sophie felt a strange warmth in her chest, as if part of the act had already begun to feel real. During dinner, A board member's wife leaned closer and whispered, "You are the first woman he has brought to one of these events in years. You must be special." Sophie smiled faintly, her fork trembling slightly. "Maybe I am just lucky." Ethan caught her gaze from across the table, a silent reassurance in his eyes. When the evening finally ended, they stepped out into the cool night. Sophie exhaled, half laughing. "I cannot believe I survived that." Ethan's lips curved. "You did more than survive. You were extraordinary." The car door closed behind them, and for the first time, the silence between them was gentle. As the city lights drifted past, Sophie realized that the performance they had agreed upon was already blurring with something unspoken, something neither of them could define yet. The following week passed in a blur of glittering events and carefully choreographed appearances. Sophie had learned to smile at the right time, to nod during conversations about companies and markets she barely understood, and to keep her emotions hidden behind a calm expression. Every evening she stood beside Ethan, playing the role of the perfect partner, and every night she returned to her small apartment, reminding herself that it was only a job. Tonight was different. It was the annual Carter Foundation Gala, a charity event that gathered some of the most influential people in New York City. The moment Sophie stepped out of the car, she felt the pressure of hundreds of eyes. Cameras flashed again, brighter than before. She tried to steady her breathing. Ethan offered his arm, his composure as flawless as ever. Inside, the ballroom was even grander than she remembered: arches of crystal, golden drapes, and a string quartet playing near the stage. Ethan leaned close enough for her to hear him over the music. "Remember, this is a friendly crowd. Just be yourself." She nodded. "Myself does not belong in rooms like this." He smiled faintly. "That is why they will like you." The evening unfolded smoothly until midway through dinner, when one of the investors, a man named Richard Stone, approached their table. His tone was polite but edged with arrogance. "Mr. Reed," he said, glancing at Sophie, "I did not know you were seeing someone new. You keep surprising us." Ethan maintained his polite smile. "Surprises keep life interesting." Richard's gaze lingered on Sophie. "And what do you do, Miss Hart?" Sophie swallowed. "Public relations," she replied calmly. "Ah," Richard said, a smirk curling his mouth. "So you are in the business of appearances, just like him." A few guests chuckled quietly. Sophie felt the flush rising to her cheeks. For a moment, she wanted to disappear. But Ethan spoke before she could respond. His voice was cool but firm. "She is in the business of communication, Mr. Stone. Something you could use a lesson in." The laughter at the table shifted, polite and nervous. Richard's smirk faded, and he raised his glass to hide his embarrassment. Sophie exhaled slowly, grateful and stunned. Later, as the band began to play, Ethan asked her to dance. The crowd moved aside as they stepped onto the floor. The music was soft, romantic, the kind that made time slow down. "You handled yourself well tonight," Ethan said quietly. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but you saved me." He looked down at her, his eyes warm. "You did not need saving. You only needed someone to see you." They moved together in rhythm, the lights above them shimmering like falling stars. For a fleeting moment, the noise of the world faded away. Sophie felt the weight of her fears lift, replaced by something fragile and bright. When the song ended, the applause rippled around them. Ethan kept his hand at her waist a second too long before stepping back. "We make a convincing team," he said. Sophie smiled, her heart racing. Almost too convincing. As they walked off the dance floor, flashes from photographers captured the image of them laughing together. What began as an arrangement now looked, to everyone watching and perhaps to themselves, like the start of something genuine. A few days later, Sophie found herself standing on the rooftop terrace of Ethan's penthouse. The city stretched endlessly below, a sea of lights that shimmered like restless stars. The night breeze lifted the edge of her silk shawl as she gazed across the skyline. It had been 2 weeks since she signed the contract, and in that short time, her life had changed more than she could ever have imagined. Ethan joined her quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee instead of wine. "You survived another week of pretending," he said with a soft smile. "That deserves a toast." "Oh." She took the mug, laughing lightly. "A toast with coffee? That is new." "It is safer," he said. Champagne makes people confess too much. They stood side by side, the city humming below them. For the first time since their arrangement began, the silence between them felt comfortable. Sophie turned toward him. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" she asked. "The suits, the headlines, the constant attention?" Ethan's eyes drifted toward the lights of the city. "Every single day," he said quietly. "But I built this world myself, and now it will not let me leave." There was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. "You sound lonely," she said softly. He looked at her, the flicker of vulnerability crossing his face before he masked it again. "Loneliness is part of the job description," he said. "It keeps people from getting close enough to hurt you." Sophie hesitated. "That sounds like a terrible way to live." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe that is why I agreed to your strange request that night. You looked at me like I was human, not a headline." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through her hair. Sophie felt the line between real and pretend blur again, the distance between them shrinking with every unspoken word. Ethan broke the silence first. "I have something to show you." He led her inside to a small room she had never noticed before. The walls were filled with sketches and photographs of architecture, travel, and handwritten notes. "This was my father's studio," he said. "He wanted me to be an architect, not a businessman. I kept it because it reminds me of what I used to love." Sophie touched one of the old blueprints. "It is beautiful," she whispered. He watched her fingers trace the paper. "You have a way of seeing beauty in things most people overlook." She turned to face him. "And you hide beauty behind things that look cold?" she said gently. Their eyes met. For the first time, Ethan looked away first. "The contract ends next week," he said quietly. "When it does, I will transfer the remaining payment to your account." Sophie nodded slowly, her chest tightening in a way she did not expect. "Right, that is what we agreed." He tried to smile, but it faltered. "Yes, that is what we agreed." The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. She could feel his distance, and yet, the way his voice softened when he said her name betrayed something real. As she left the studio and walked down the quiet hallway, Sophie realized that what began as a lie had become the most honest part of her life. And for the first time, the thought of the contract ending felt less like freedom and more like loss. The next morning, the headlines appeared before Sophie even opened her eyes. Her phone vibrated nonstop, the screen filled with messages and missed calls. When she finally answered one, her friend from the public relations firm spoke in a trembling voice. "Sophie, do not go online. Someone leaked pictures of you and Ethan. They are saying you were paid to pretend to be his girlfriend." Sophie's heart dropped. She sat frozen on her bed, staring at the bright screen. The article was everywhere, her name, her face, every photograph from the charity gala. The headline screamed, "CEO Ethan Reed, caught in contract relationship scandal." By the time she reached Ethan's office, reporters were already crowding the front steps. Cameras flashed like lightning. Someone shouted her name, asking if she was his hired companion. She pushed through the chaos, her pulse pounding in her ears. Inside, Ethan's assistant tried to stop her. "He is in a meeting with the board," the woman said nervously. "It is bad, Sophie. The investors are furious. They think this will ruin the company's image." "I just need to talk to him," Sophie said, her voice shaking. She slipped past before anyone could stop her. Ethan stood by the window, his jacket off, his posture tense. The board members were leaving, whispering among themselves. When the door closed, he turned toward her. "Why did you come here?" he asked quietly. Sophie swallowed hard. "Because everyone is saying I exposed the contract." "You know I did not." "I know," he said, rubbing his temples. "But they do not care who did. They only care about the damage." "So you believe them?" she asked. "After everything?" Ethan's expression faltered. "It is not about belief. It is about control. This scandal could destroy more than my reputation. It could cost hundreds of people their jobs." Her chest tightened. "And what about me? My job is already gone. My name is everywhere. You can hide behind your lawyers, but I cannot." He took a step closer. "Sophie, I am trying to fix this." Her voice rose despite herself. "By pretending again? By acting like I never existed?" He looked at her helplessly, his control cracking for the first time. "You were never supposed to get hurt. That was the one thing I promised myself." Tears burned behind her eyes. "You made me believe we were something real," she whispered. "But it was just another performance, wasn't it?" He did not answer. The silence said enough. Sophie turned toward the door, her hands trembling. "The contract ends tomorrow," she said softly. "You do not have to pay me. I do not want your money." "Sophie, please," he said, his voice breaking slightly. But she did not turn back. Outside, the press swarmed around her again. Flashbulbs exploded like thunder. Someone shouted a cruel question, and Sophie kept walking, tears hidden by the cold rain beginning to fall. From the window above, Ethan watched her disappear into the blur of umbrellas and flashing lights. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, not because of business, not because of the board, but because he had just lost the only person who had ever seen him as a man rather than a name. 3 days passed before the storm began to quiet. Sophie had turned off her phone and locked herself inside her apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the world outside. The internet had already decided her story headlines called her a fraud, a manipulator, a woman who had traded dignity for wealth. Each word cut deeper than the last. Her refrigerator was nearly empty, her savings drained, but she did not care. The humiliation hurt more than hunger ever could. She thought about leaving the city altogether, disappearing somewhere, no one knew her name. But the sound of knocking pulled her back from that thought. She hesitated, expecting another reporter, but when she opened the door, it was Ethan. He stood in the hallway, rain dripping from his coat, exhaustion darkening his eyes. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Sophie crossed her arms, her voice steady, though her heart was not. "What do you want, Ethan?" "I want to fix this," he said. "They blamed you for something I caused. I should have spoken sooner." "You had plenty of chances," she said bitterly. "You chose silence." He took a step forward. "Because I was trying to protect you. The board wanted a statement that distanced the company from you. I refused. They threatened to remove me. I told them the truth today." Sophie frowned, uncertain if she believed him. "What truth?" "That I created the arrangement," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. "That I offered you the contract. That you never took a cent you did not earn. I told them you walked away without payment, even when you had every right to take it." Sophie stared at him, stunned. "You said that publicly?" He nodded. "At the press conference this morning. I told them you were the most honest person I had ever met." Her throat tightened. "And what happened?" "They voted to suspend me until the investigation ends," he said simply. "It is fair. I built my empire on control. And I lost it because I forgot what mattered." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside softened to a steady rhythm. Sophie felt the wall she had built inside her start to crack. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you deserve to hear it from me," Ethan said. "And because I am not asking for forgiveness, I am asking for a chance to start again, this time without pretending." Sophie looked away, tears blurring her vision. "You ruined everything, Ethan. My job, my name." "I know," he interrupted gently. "That is why I have been working on something. The Carter Foundation is opening a new program to fund small community firms. Your old company applied. I made sure they got the grant." She blinked in disbelief. "You did that?" He nodded. "You once said all you wanted was a chance to prove yourself. Now you have it." Sophie pressed her lips together, torn between anger and something she could not name. "You cannot buy forgiveness," she said softly. "I am not trying to," he replied. "I am trying to earn trust." The silence stretched again, fragile but no longer cold. Finally, Sophie stepped aside. "You should come in," she said quietly. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. As he crossed the threshold, Sophie realized that the scandal had stripped away everything false between them. What was left was raw, uncertain, and real, the beginning of something neither of them could stage or control. Spring arrived quietly in New York City, washing away the last traces of winter and scandal. The newspapers had moved on to new stories, and the world seemed to forget what had once consumed it. Sophie, however, remembered everything. She spent her days rebuilding her small public relations company, now funded through the Carter Foundation grant Ethan had secured. It was not easy, But it was honest work, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Weeks had passed since Ethan's confession. She had not seen him since that night in her apartment. Every so often, she caught his name on business channels, usually followed by the words "suspended" or "pending review." Still, she found herself hoping he was all right. One afternoon, Sophie was preparing a presentation for a local nonprofit when her assistant handed her an envelope. The handwriting was familiar, neat, deliberate, unmistakably his. Inside was a single line written in dark ink. "The gallery opens tonight. I kept my promise. I hope you will come." The message carried no explanation, but her heart already knew. That evening, she arrived at a quiet street in Chelsea, where a small art gallery glowed beneath soft lights. The sign outside read, "The Art of Honesty, a Dedication." Inside, paintings and photographs lined the walls, snapshots of moments she recognized from their time together. A sketch of the ballroom chandelier, a photograph of the rooftop skyline, a watercolor of a woman standing in the rain, head held high. Ethan stood near the center of the room, speaking with a small group of guests. When he turned and saw her, his expression softened instantly. He excused himself and walked toward her, his steps slow, unsure. "You came," he said quietly. "You invited me," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "I was curious what promise you were talking about." He smiled faintly. "The one I made when we signed that contract. I told you I would make sure your story ended with dignity. This gallery is for you. Every piece here was inspired by what you taught me about truth." Sophie's eyes glistened as she looked around. "You did not have to do this." "I wanted to," he said. "It was never about appearances anymore. It was about gratitude." For a long moment, they stood in silence, surrounded by soft music and the hum of quiet admiration from the crowd. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. "I do not have a contract this time," he said gently. "Just a question." He opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring. "Will you give me another chance? Not to pretend, not to fix, but to start honestly." Sophie stared at him, her heart full. All the pain, the chaos, the doubt it had led to this one moment of clarity. She took a slow breath and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "But only if you promise to keep being human." "Oh!" Ethan laughed softly, relief breaking through his voice. "That I can promise." Applause rippled gently through the room as the music swelled. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, not as a symbol of power or guilt, but of choice. Later that night, as they stood together under the soft city lights, Sophie leaned against him and smiled. "It started as a lie," she said quietly. "But it ended as the most truthful thing I have ever known." Ethan tightened his arm around her, his voice low. "Sometimes, pretending leads us to who we really are." And with that, they walked out into the spring air, two people no longer bound by contracts or secrets, but by the simple, ordinary miracle of love and redemption.